This week I decided to start building my own machine learning workstation. If you've ever heard me talk about this before, you know that I do not recommend most people do this, and I would probably say I still don't recommend most people do this. The reason I decided to build my own machine was mostly about cost. I mean, I've been using rented servers either from Paperspace or using a thing called Vast AI for about 8 months now, pretty much continuously. And when I did the math, it ended up being pretty expensive, and also like I realized that I could actually save myself some money running my own machine. So I started researching into how to build my own machine, read a bunch of stuff, watched a bunch of videos, and decided it was time to build my own. I'd actually been considering doing this for a couple months, and I just hadn't really been able to find a way to make the money make sense. And then obviously it's tax season, so I saw what my tax return was going to be and decided to go for it. So I'm going to talk through this, just sort of how I went about building things, and why I chose certain pieces. I will also say that I'll talk a little bit at the end about what I would change. So I'll just go through the pieces. I'm going to talk about this like you are like me, and that this is the first PC you're building. I have done a little bit of stuff like replaced video cards and that sort of thing, but I never really built my own. And obviously, like where the state of what I probably changed a video card like 5 or 6 years ago, the state of where we are now in terms of CPUs and builds is pretty intense. So I'll just walk through and sort of explain stuff. If you don't know what some of these pieces are, I'll explain why they're necessary or things I've read that are recommendations, that sort of thing. I'll post a link to this part picker list. The thing is, everyone uses PC part picker for a couple reasons. One, it lists out all the prices based on a couple big major stores. It also has some compatibility checks, which are like huge. If you're new to building a PC, you definitely need those. And it also does some wattage lists, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I'll post a link. This is what I ended up building. Pretty close to what I ended up with. The price is pretty far off, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The very first thing that you need to think about when you're doing machine learning is what sort of GPU do you need. So if you're doing anything in the StyleGAN range, you pretty much have to have a 16 gigabyte video card. And there's a bunch and it has to be NVIDIA as well. So it has to be NVIDIA, it has to be at least 16 gigabytes. You could get away with 11 or 12, but it'll pretty severely limit what you can do. For me, I had been renting a Quadro P6000 for a couple months, and it allowed me to do some higher res work as well as some other things. The thing about this card in particular is that obviously, one, it's expensive. Two, it is slower than a lot of other video cards. I decided that the high res work was more important to me than speed. So that's an important consideration. Lastly, I should say I did not pay this price for this card. I actually found a used one on eBay. I paid about $1,900 for it, which is still not a cheap amount. And obviously, buying a used video card off eBay has some risks, but it did work for me, so fingers crossed. I also think that I've seen on Amazon, this P6000 is about $3,000, so it's definitely not this price, so don't be sticker shocked by this. You can definitely find it cheaper. A really important thing to know about the Quadro is that there are many different numbered versions of Quadros. There's a Quadro RTX P6000, which I believe is the newer one, and that one is pretty pricey. It might actually be around this price. There's the P6000 where there's no RTX. That is the one that I just bought. That's the one that if you use Paperspace's highest, they actually have one called the P6000. It is literally using that video card. That's the one that they use. I think it's been out for a couple of years, so it's not like top of the line, but it is pretty nice. There's also a 6000. There's a Quadro 6000, which does not have a P in front of it. Make sure you do not buy that one. It'll be much cheaper. The thing is, it's only 6 gigabytes, so make sure you don't make that mistake. I've gone through eBay searches and was sort of like, ooh, I should buy that, and then I realized what I was actually buying and did not buy it. So make sure you don't make that mistake. I would say for most people, 16 gigabytes is probably fine. I would also say like you shouldn't really be building a machine unless you've like clearly demonstrated that you really like this work and want to build more. But in case you are really into it, this is the thing you can do. So start with a GPU. That was the number one reason why I was able to build this box, is because I found one that I thought was within my price range on eBay. The next thing you need to figure out is your motherboard and your CPU. And one thing that's really important is that you have to make sure they match up. CPU and motherboard are basically required to go together. So in this case, I used an AMD Threadripper, and the motherboard. There's a couple of different options, but the motherboard is usually an X399. There's a couple different motherboards you can pick, but you have to make sure they match up. So this is where the compatibility filter within PC Part Picker is really, really important. Why I choose the Threadripper, I'd seen a bunch of people online say that it worked well. It was pretty affordable. I would say like a lot of my build is like a lot of these pieces are about 2 years old, 3 years old now, which means they've like gone down in price. It also means they're not the fastest or the best things. But for me, that's fine. I needed this box to be able to like build, to like do the work I need to do. And if it's a little bit slower, that's fine for me. Not the end of the world. So I went with AMD. I've seen other people say Intel's better. It's your call. Look at the price points. Maybe it's like I would also say like a lot of these prices fluctuate pretty frequently. So what you build 3 months from now might be different than what I built, just based on price and that sort of thing. With the Threadripper and pretty much with any CPU that you're gonna, so basically like I should also say the motherboard is like the smart, like is the engine of your car. It is the thing that runs off everything. So when you plug things into the back of your computer, you're plugging that in the motherboard. The motherboard sort of is the brain. It like manages everything. The CPU is something that's really important alongside that. CPUs, things to look out for are how many cores are in there, how many cores and how many threads. Those are sort of the two big things to look at. The more cores you have, the more expensive it's going to be, the faster it will run. That's pretty much everything I think I want to say about the AMD processor. When you have a CPU at any of these levels, you pretty much have to have a cooler. I looked at a lot of different options. It seemed like the liquid CPU cooler was sort of the one that everyone was using. It's fairly affordable, this particular one. I have a little bit more to say about this one that I'll say at the end, but essentially this was like right within my price point, although I've yet to do the rebate. I need to do that. But it's good. There are lots of videos online to sort of figure out how to orient this and use it in your machine. I'll talk a little bit about building this thing at the very end. So this is just generally you need these three things to go together. Make sure that whatever cooler you're using does work with your particular brand. With the Threadripper, you get your own housing that fits on the CPU cooler, so it always fits. So these three things work pretty well together. Memory. So memory, again, the memory, I don't know how much you know about memory, but memory has a bunch of sticks. There's these long sticks. They slot into the motherboard. So whatever motherboard you get, you have to make sure that there are a good number of slots. Most motherboards have about 8 slots now. And then memory comes in two different varieties mostly. There's 16 gigabyte and 8 gigabyte, and they're usually paired up. So you match them up with pairs. Everything I read online said that your memory, the size of your memory needs to match at least the size of your video card. Otherwise you get bottlenecks, other things. I decided to double it, so I have 64 gigabytes total. I could go up to 128 in the motherboard. That felt unnecessary and kind of overkill. Although I might eventually in the near future get another 32 gig pack, just to give myself a little bit more memory. But in general, this is probably enough. There's lots of options with memory. The other thing that I should say is like I do not care about RGB. I do not care about flashiness in any of my machines. This thing is just really a workhorse, so I went for like all black basic looking stuff or whatever was cheapest, to be quite honest, where I could. So 2 packs of 16 gigabyte. You could obviously get 8 gigabyte. I think 8 gigabyte will be much cheaper, but then you are sort of limited in what you can actually like add on to. So a lot of times in building these machines, you also want to think about like what can I get away with now, and then what could I add to over time. Solid state drive versus internal hard drive. So solid state is much faster, but it's also much more expensive for the size. I know that because I work a lot with images, I have huge data sets of images and that sort of thing. So I wanted to make sure that I got the largest solid state I could get. That's going to make it faster. So basically anything that runs off this drive is going to run faster than anything that runs off of your hard drive. So this might be where I'm doing active work. Active work goes in this folder. And then like anything I want to save over time will go in this folder. I also have a bunch of backups. So like hard drive space isn't huge for me, but it is important to know about these things. So I've maxed out sort of like, I think the largest you can get for an M2 card is 1 terabyte. I don't think I've really seen anything bigger than that. But I did go with this. Crucial, it happens to be like a brand that I know and am familiar with. It happens to be pretty affordable, so this worked out. So I have a total of 9 terabytes of space within this machine. I know I could actually fill that up pretty quickly, but that's pretty good to start with. Video card we already talked about. So the last, well, okay, so I'll talk a little bit about power slips. I'll talk about case last, and I'll talk about the power supply next. The power supply, everything I read was basically that you need to add up all of the wattage usage of your entire machine, and then you need to add a little bit of wattage just to have some overage available to you. The estimated wattage for this thing ended up being about 600 watts. In hindsight, so I went with an 850. 850 is fine. It will definitely work for this machine. In hindsight, I probably should have gone to about 1,000. 1,000 would have been better because in some case that I buy a second video card, I could keep the power supply I have. And obviously the power supply is what like powers everything. So this would have been, that probably would have been a better solution. It's fine. If you're wondering what the difference between gold certified, platinum certified, silver, whatever, as far as I understand it, that's sort of like an economy thing. So gold and platinum tend to be the best in terms of environmental features. I'm obviously already killing the planet with my machine, so I decided to go with gold as like a slightly better for the environment option. Okay, so let's talk about cases. Cases, quite honestly, like this is the most confusing thing to me. I do not know what case is right for what. One thing I do know is that this machine will get very hot. This video card plus this particular core processor is going to be very hot. So I went with a case that has a lot of flow through. Airflow through your machine is really important. This Fractal seemed like a case that a lot of people were okay with. And this is maybe the one area where I went with something that I thought was a little bit attractive visually. If I had to do it all over again, I would probably change this case. If you notice in the video that I posted about my machine, this video card pushes right up against the edge of this case, where plus the case plus the cooler, there's just barely enough room for this card. I think if I were to do it again, I would probably get a bigger case, just to fit a little bit more room in there. I do like this case overall. It's very nice. It feels like there's a lot of airflow through it, but that's the one sort of thing where I'm a little iffy on it. It made routing cables around this machine like a little bit tricky, and it sort of forced me into a place where the cooler has to go at the top of the case. And it's not the best solution, but it's fine. It is fine for what it is, but I definitely would have maybe rethought this. So if you're building this and you want to build something similar, maybe think about a bigger case. Mid-tower cases are generally about the size. There are very large cases, and then there are mid-towers, and I would look at the dimensions, look at the interior dimension of how this all works. One thing to note is that with this machine, none of this has Wi-Fi. Some motherboards come with Wi-Fi installed on them. This one did not. So after I built it, I realized I had no way to get into the internet from this machine, which makes installing software very, very hard. So I did buy very recently a Wi-Fi card for it. And if anyone's interested in what I bought, I can share it with you, but I didn't really I just sort of chose whatever Amazon or other places recommended to me. Also worth noting is that I already had a monitor, I already had a mouse, and I already had a keyboard. And because I'm not really going to be using this day to day, like to stare at the machine, I went with like the most inexpensive monitor that I think Wirecutter suggested. So you'll still need that. If you don't have any of those things, you'll need that in order to get everything. So this is pretty much what I built. Like I said, the compatibility section is really important. You want to make sure that you're not buying things that don't work together. So if you use PC Part Picker and you choose an Intel CPU and an AMD motherboard, it's going to let you know like, hey, you can't do this. So this is a pretty helpful site. I definitely recommend trying it out. In the end, I think I mostly bought from whatever store it told me to, but in the case of something like B&H, it was like $3 cheaper on Amazon, and I was already buying from Amazon, so I just went with that. But this is generally like a good solution. I'm pretty happy with this board, with this machine. I think in the next video, I will probably talk about like all the software I need to install. I'm not going to tell you like how I built this, because honestly, this is the first build I've ever done, and there are much better websites online and YouTube videos online of like how to actually build your machine. You should not follow my process. I watched a bunch of videos to build it, but So I sort of knew, but in general, like what I end up doing is I just end up Googling like Gigabyte X99 Aorus Pro install, and usually I will find someone who's installed it. Usually a part of a bigger build, but I like see how that part works. Then I might find a video of the EVGA CLC, see how they built that, and like kind of cobble it together myself. My first build, it probably took about 2 hours of me to build stuff. That was like kind of me pausing and doing other things at the same time. Um, I was certainly pretty nervous in making it, but it did work out, and it posted on the first try, so that was pretty awesome. So I'm glad that all worked out. But in general, like you will probably be nervous about your own first build. You'll hear stories about like it not posting or your motherboard being dead, like those sort of things. But I've found if you just follow a lot of the videos that are out there online from experts in building PCs, like you'll be fine. So let me know what other questions you have. I'm gonna try to do a little bit of a series on building this system because I think I have heard from people that they're interested in learning more about how to do this. So the next video is gonna be on software. I assume the software piece will be much harder, and it'll be much more tied to what exactly I'm working on. So this is mostly gonna be built for like a StyleGAN model, which means I'm gonna have to keep a very close eye on like all my different software installs for dependencies and those sort of things. So I'll make that next video, but in the meantime, hit me up on YouTube or on Slack if you have questions. Thanks.